Tom Walker stood in the dim light of his kitchen, the acrid tang of overcooked coffee stinging his tongue as he took a reluctant sip. At 45. His face bore the rugged lines of a man who'd spent decades barking orders under the relentless sun at construction sites, his authority as unyielding as the steel beams he commanded. Streaks of gray threaded through his dark hair at the temples, a quiet testament to time, but his piercing blue eyes, sharp as they'd been in his military days, missed nothing. This morning, though, his usual precision had faltered. His mind, tangled in restless thoughts he couldn't quite pin down, had let the brew sit too long on the burner, turning it into a bitter sludge. He reached for the newspaper, craving the stillness of this fleeting ritual before the chaos of the workday swallowed him whole. The kitchen around him was modest but meticulous, stainless steel pans hung in neat rows, the counter wiped spotless, everything reflecting the disciplined pragmatism that defined him. It wasn't a lavish life, not on a construction foreman's salary, but it was enough. Enough for him, for his wife Eleanor, and for their 21-year-old daughter Ava, a family he'd built with steady hands and a stubborn heart. The shrill ring of his phone shattered the quiet like a gunshot. Tom's hand paused, hovering over his coffee mug, as the screen flashed an unknown number. He answered, his voice gruff but steady. Walker. On the other end, a woman's voice cut through, crisp and clinical. Mr. Walker, this is Memorial Hospital. Your daughter Ava has been brought to our emergency department. The words landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from his lungs. His fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles whitened. What happened? He demanded, but the voice remained maddeningly vague. We can't discuss details over the phone, sir. You should come immediately. I'm on my way, he said, his tone betraying none of the storm brewing inside him. His pulse hammered in his ears as he snatched his jacket from the hook. Leaving his untouched breakfast, a slice of toast and a congealing egg, abandoned on the counter. His heavy boots pounded the linoleum as he strode out. The roar of his old pickup truck's engine filling the crisp morning air as he peeled out of the driveway with a precision that masked his rising panic. The hospital loomed ahead, its fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of angry bees as Tom stormed through the emergency department doors. A nurse, her face a mask of practiced calm, pointed him toward a curtained bay. His military instincts snapped into place, scanning the scene with cold efficiency as he approached. There, on a sterile white bed, lay Ava, his Ava, her face a map of bruises. Her right eye swollen shut, tears carving paths down her battered cheeks. Her trembling hands clutched the flimsy hospital blanket as if it could shield her from the world. Daddy, she choked out, her voice breaking on the word, and Tom was at her side in an instant, his calloused hand enveloping hers with a tenderness that belied the rage coiling in his chest. I'm here, baby girl, he murmured, his voice a low rumble of reassurance. Tell me what happened. Her words spilled out in jagged sobs, each one slicing deeper into him. I came home early from Sarah's. I heard noises upstairs, in your bedroom. She squeezed her eyes shut, as if she could unsee it. Mom was there, with Uncle Rick. Her whisper barely carried the weight of the betrayal. They were together. The revelation hit Tom like a sledgehammer, splintering the foundation of 23 years. Eleanor, his wife. His partner through countless quiet mornings and hard-earned nights, entwined with Rick, her own brother. Rick, the slick-talking businessman with his tailored suits and oily charm. Always working some angle behind those smug, condescending smiles. Tom's jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Go on, he urged, his voice dangerously calm. Ava's breath hitched. I screamed. Then these two men came out of nowhere, Rick's bodyguards. They grabbed me, threw me down the stairs. Her body shook with fresh sobs, her frail frame curling in on itself. They're still there, Dad. Drinking your whiskey. Laughing. Tom rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate, a predator sizing up its prey. "Did you see a doctor yet?" he asked. "They're waiting for X-rays." She whispered. "Good." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering there as her warmth anchored him. "I'll be back soon." Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "Dad. Don't do anything stupid." His lips twitched into a smile, cold, brittle, and utterly devoid of humor. "Nothing stupid. Just necessary." At the nurse's station, Tom loomed over the desk. His presence a quiet threat. "My daughter, Ava Walker. I need to know her injuries." The nurse tapped at her keyboard, her eyes flickering between the screen and the man before her. "Contusions. Possible concussion. X-rays pending for her ribs and right wrist. Pain meds ordered." Tom cut her off, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I want everything. Photos of her injuries. Medical reports, all of it." She hesitated. "That's not standard procedure, sir." "Make it happen," he said, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that left no room for argument. "Those bastards aren't getting away with this." She studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "I'll see what I can do." Back in his own head, Tom's thoughts churned like a gathering storm. Eleanor, his Eleanor, had stabbed him in the back with the one person he'd always distrusted. Rick, with his expensive wines and veiled barbs at family dinners, had never fooled Tom entirely. There'd always been something off about him, a shadow beneath the polish, too much money, too few answers. But bodyguards? That wasn't just an affair. That was power. The kind that came with dirty deals and hired muscle willing to toss a young woman down a flight of stairs without blinking. Tom pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't touched in years. The line crackling to life with a familiar gruff voice. "It's Walker. Remember that favor you owe me from Kandahar?" He paused, listening to the silent stretch. "I'm calling it in. I need everything you can dig up on Richard Thorne's business operations. Everything." He hung up, staring at the emergency room doors as the weight of 23 years crumbled around him. Shared holidays, late-night talks, the life they'd built, it was all a lie. But the betrayal wasn't what fueled his fury. It was Ava, his little girl, bruised and broken because of them. That was a line no father could forgive. He returned to Ava's bedside, where she'd slipped into a fitful sleep, the pain meds dulling her edges. He watched her, memorizing every mark on her face. Each one a silent vow etched into his soul. He'd been there the day she was born, a tiny, squalling thing he'd promised to protect with his life. Today, he'd failed her. Tomorrow, he wouldn't. A doctor approached, clipboard in hand, his expression cautious. "Mr. Walker, we need to discuss your daughter's injuries." "In a minute," Tom replied, his eyes never leaving Ava. He stepped away. Dialing another number. "Detective Ramirez, this is Thomas Walker. We need to talk about Richard Thorne and his associates." The line buzzed with a brief exchange. "No, not at the station. Somewhere private. This goes deeper than you know." He ended the call and turned back to the doctor, who stood waiting with quiet patience. "Tell me everything," Tom said, his voice like steel. "I want to know exactly what they did to my little girl." As the doctor listed Ava's injuries, bruises blooming across her ribs, a wrist that might be fractured, a concussion that could linger, Tom's rage hardened into something icy and unyielding. Eleanor, Rick, those thuggish bodyguards, they thought they were untouchable, lounging in his home, sipping his whiskey, laughing at his expense. They were wrong. They didn't know the man they'd crossed, a man forged in war, tempered by loss, and driven by a love that burned fiercer than any hate. He sank into the chair beside Ava's bed, his mind already plotting. First, he'd secure her safety. Then, he'd unearth every secret Rick had buried. And then, then, they'd face the consequences of crossing Thomas Walker. They'd learn what it meant to hurt his daughter and think they could walk away unscathed. Tom's truck rolled slowly down his street. His sharp eyes catching the glint of two black SUVs parked brazenly in his driveway. Tinted windows. Polished chrome, professional muscle trying to blend into a blue-collar neighborhood and failing miserably. Amateurs, he thought, parking a block away and slipping out into the shadows. His military training took over, guiding his steps as he approached on foot, silent as a ghost. The front door hung ajar, spilling a wedge of light onto the porch. Accompanied by the thump of bass-heavy music and the coarse laughter of men who didn't belong. Tom eased through the side door, moving through his own house like a stranger. Every creak of the floorboards masked by the blaring sound system. The air reeked of cigarette smoke, a violation in a home where he'd never allowed it, and voices drifted from the living room. Loud and careless. Rick's deep, arrogant laugh cut through first. You should have seen his face when I showed up at Christmas dinner. Thanks for the wine, Rick. Clueless bastard. More laughter followed, and then Eleanor's voice, slurred, unsteady, dripping with a mockery that twisted Tom's gut. He never suspected a thing. Too busy with his precious routine, coffee at 6. News at 6:15. His hands balled into fists, nails digging into his palms as 23 years of marriage dissolved into a punchline for her brother's amusement. He stepped into the doorway. The scene searing itself into his mind, Eleanor sprawled across the couch, her blouse half unbuttoned, a drink sloshing in her hand, Rick lounging beside her. His arm draped casually over the cushions, exuding the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. Two men clad in sleek black suits lingered near the windows. Their broad shoulders squared as if they were guarding some priceless treasure. Each clutched a beer bottle, the condensation dripping onto their polished shoes, undermining the air of professionalism they so desperately tried to project. Their eyes flicked nervously around the room, scanning the crowd of partygoers lost in the pulsing rhythm of the music. Then, like a blade slicing through the noise, Tom's voice erupted, sharp and commanding. Get out. The words hung heavy in the air, halting the room in an instant. Conversations died mid-sentence. Laughter choked off, and the clinking of glasses ceased. Eleanor, caught off guard, felt her fingers loosen around her drink. The glass slipped, tumbling to the floor in slow motion. Its contents splashing across the pristine beige carpet Tom had spent hours choosing last summer. The amber liquid seeped into the fibers, a stain spreading like the tension now gripping the space. Rick, leaning casually against the wall with Eleanor tucked possessively under his arm, froze mid-smirk. His lips twitched as if unsure whether to hold the grin or let it fade entirely. Well. He drawled, his voice oily with mockery, though his gaze darted toward the two bodyguards, betraying a flicker of unease. The man of the house returns. His bravado sounded hollow. A thin veneer over the panic simmering beneath. Tom didn't flinch. 5 seconds, he said, his tone low and deliberate, each syllable a ticking clock. Then I start removing you myself. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of his threat, the air growing thick with anticipation. The younger of the two guards stepped forward. His muscled frame straining against the ill-fitting suit that clung to him like a child playing dress-up. His jaw tightened, bravado masking his inexperience. Listen, buddy, he began. But the words barely left his mouth before Tom exploded into motion. Years of combat training surged through him, a primal force honed in the crucible of war. His fist connected with the guard's throat in a single, devastating strike, crushing the larynx with a sickening crunch. The man's eyes bulged. Hands flying to his neck as he gasped for air that wouldn't come. Before he could stagger back, Tom's knee rocketed upward, slamming into the guard's solar plexus with merciless precision. The guard crumpled to the floor, a broken heap of muscle and bravado, his wheezes rasping against the silence. The second guard, older and wirier, reacted on instinct. His hand darting toward the holster concealed beneath his jacket. But Tom was faster. He seized the man's arm mid-motion, twisting it with a brutal efficiency that snapped bones like dry twigs. A scream tore from the guard's throat, raw and guttural, only to be silenced as Tom drove his head into the wall. The first impact cracked plaster. The second left a smear of blood as the man's body went limp, sliding down in a marionette tangle of limbs. 15 seconds had passed. 2 threats lay neutralized at Tom's feet. The room a battlefield of his making. Rick stumbled backward, his polished veneer shattering as he yanked Eleanor with him. His fingers dug into her arm. A desperate anchor in the storm bearing down on him. "Now, Tom," he stammered, sweat beading on his brow, "let's be reasonable." His voice cracked, the plea of a man who knew he'd miscalculated. Tom advanced, each step a predator's prowl, his eyes burning with a fury that had simmered too long. "Reasonable," he spat, the word dripping with contempt. "Like your men were reasonable with my daughter?" Eleanor, trembling in Rick's grip, couldn't hold back any longer. "She shouldn't have been here," she blurted. Her voice shrill with fear and defiance. "It's not our fault." The accusation hung between them, a spark igniting Tom's rage. His hand lashed out. The back of it striking her cheek with a crack that reverberated through the room like a gunshot. Eleanor sprawled onto the couch, one hand clutching her stinging face. Her wide eyes locked on Tom in disbelief. She'd never seen this side of him, this cold, unyielding force, and it terrified her to her core. "Don't you dare," Tom growled. His voice a low rumble of thunder, "don't you dare blame her." Rick, seizing the moment, edged toward the door, his polished shoes scuffing the hardwood in his haste. But Tom's hand shot out, seizing him by the throat and slamming him against the wall with a force that rattled the picture frames. Rick's feet dangled inches above the floor, his face reddening as he clawed at Tom's iron grip. "Please," he wheezed, the word barely audible, "we can talk about this." Tom's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening. "Talk," he snarled. "Like your men talk to Ava with their fists?" He drove his knee into Rick's stomach, the impact doubling him over as Tom released him. Rick collapsed, gasping. Only to feel the toe of Tom's boot crash into his ribs, once, twice, 3 times, each blow a punctuation mark of retribution. "Stop!" Eleanor screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria as she scrambled to her feet. "You'll kill him." Tom turned to her, his expression eerily calm, a stillness that chilled her more than his rage ever could. "No," he said, his voice a quiet promise, "not yet." He grabbed Rick by the hair, yanking his head up so their eyes met. Rick's face was a mess of blood and tears, his bravado stripped away. "Your men hurt my little girl," Tom said, each word deliberate. "Think I'll return the favor?" What followed was a masterclass in controlled brutality. Tom knew the human body's limits, where to strike, how hard, how long, and he wielded that knowledge like a surgeon with a scalpel. Every punch, every kick was calculated to keep Rick conscious, to make him feel the full weight of his sins. When it was over, Rick lay curled on the floor, sobbing, blood dripping from his nose and split lips, pooling on the carpet in dark, glistening patches. Tom turned to Eleanor, who pressed herself against the couch, her trembling hands clutching the cushions as if they could shield her from his gaze. "Tommy, please," she whimpered. Her voice small and broken, "I can explain." His eyes, once warm with love, now regarded her as a stranger. "Don't call me that," he said coldly. "Get your things. Get out. If you're still here in 10 minutes, you'll wish you weren't." Eleanor staggered to her feet, mascara streaking her cheeks like black rivers. "Where am I supposed to go?" she cried. Desperation clawing at her words. Tom's laugh was bitter, devoid of warmth. "Ask your brother," he said, nodding toward Rick's crumpled form. "Once he can talk again." He turned to the bodyguards, one still unconscious, the other clutching his ruined throat, his breaths shallow and ragged. "Take your boss and get out," Tom ordered, his voice a blade's edge. "If I see any of you again, they won't find your bodies." The conscious guard, pale and shaking, dragged himself upright, his hands trembling as he helped his partner to his feet. Together, they hoisted Rick, who moaned pitifully, his blood-streaked face a testament to Tom's wrath. "This isn't over," Rick mumbled through swollen lips, defiance flickering faintly. Tom's smile was a predator's grin, sending both guards stumbling back. "You're right," he said softly. "It's just beginning." He watched as they loaded Rick into one of the SUVs parked outside. The vehicle's glossy black surface reflecting the streetlights in distorted smears. Eleanor stumbled after them, her heels catching on the gravel driveway, her tear-streaked face turning back once. But Tom had already turned away, stepping back into the house he'd built with his own hands, a sanctuary now defiled. Broken glass glittered on the floor, blood stained the carpet. And cigarette burns marred the coffee table he'd sanded and stained himself. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Mac lighting up the screen, "Found something. Meet me tonight." Tom nodded to himself, a silent vow forming in his chest. Eleanor and Rick thought this was the end, that he'd vented his rage and would slink back into the shadows. They were wrong. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice, for Ava, for the years they'd mocked him, for every holiday dinner where Rick had sat at his table, plotting betrayal. Upstairs, in the bedroom they'd once shared, the bed still bore the rumpled evidence of her affair, a tangle of sheets that smelled faintly of Rick's cologne. Tom stripped them off with methodical precision. His hands steady despite the storm raging within. He carried them to the backyard, where the cool night air brushed his skin, and piled them in the fire pit. The match flared bright as he struck it. And soon flames devoured the fabric, sending sparks spiraling into the dark. He stood there, watching the blaze, then pulled out his phone. Calls followed, to his bank, to his lawyer. To Detective Ramirez. Eleanor thought she knew him, thought he was predictable, a steady husband dulled by routine. She was about to discover how wrong she'd been. They all were. In the quiet aftermath, Tom sank into his armchair, staring at the blank television screen. The house felt hollow, a shell echoing with the ghosts of what it had once been. Blood still clung to his knuckles, Rick's blood, and his phone buzzed again. Mac. Construction site. 1 hour, he closed his eyes, memories flooding back like a tide he couldn't hold at bay. Afghanistan, 2003. The ambush. Bullets ripping through the air, the ground shaking with explosions. Mac dragging him to safety, blood and dirt caking their faces. A debt forged in gunfire. One Tom could never repay. He hadn't always been this man, capable of such cold, calculated violence. Once, he'd been a small-town kid with dreams of a simple life, a steady job, a family, a home. The military had reshaped him, taught him duty, loyalty, and the brutal truth that some problems only violence could solve. He thought of Eleanor, the day they'd met. She'd been a waitress at the diner down the road, all bright smiles and endless chatter, her apron stained with coffee. He'd just left the service, still flinching at loud noises. His mind a battlefield of its own. She'd felt like a lifeline, something solid to cling to amid the chaos. Their romance had burned fast and fierce, she'd dreamed aloud of a big house, fancy cars. The lavish life her brother Rick flaunted. Tom couldn't offer riches, but he'd given her stability, security, a home. They'd had Ava, built this life brick by brick. He'd risen from laborer to foreman, taken pride in the calluses on his hands. Eleanor had seemed content, or so he'd believed. Now, he wondered how long she'd despised those hands. How long she'd sneered at his worn boots while plotting with Rick behind his back. Rick. Tom's fists clenched at the thought of his brother-in-law. The family's golden boy. With his tailored suits and slick charm. Tom had never trusted him, had seen the shark lurking beneath the polished surface. But for Eleanor's sake, he'd let Rick into his home, shared meals with him. Endured the subtle jabs and smirking condescension. His phone rang, pulling him from the spiral. Walker, Detective Ramirez's voice cut through, no preamble. Got some info on your brother-in-law. You're not gonna like it. Tom braced himself. Tell me. Ramirez didn't hesitate. Those weren't just bodyguards. They're enforcers. Rick's running a protection racket, squeezing local businesses. He's got cops on the payroll, judges in his pocket. Tom's jaw tightened. That explained the hired muscle. There's more, Ramirez added. Your wife's been making withdrawals. Big ones. Moving money to offshore accounts. How long? Tom asked, voice flat. 6 months, at least. Walker, Ramirez paused, weighing his words. They were planning to clean you out. Divorce papers are already drawn up. They meant to leave you with nothing but debt. Tom's laugh was a harsh bark, jagged with bitterness. Appreciate the intel, detective. Ramirez's tone sharpened. Don't do anything stupid, Walker. Rick's connected. He's dangerous. So am I, Tom replied, ending the call. He rose, moving through the house with purpose. In the bedroom, he opened the closet. Pushing aside hanging clothes to reveal a hidden panel. Behind it lay a safe, his private fortress, untouched by Eleanor's prying eyes. Inside were relics of his military life, documents, medals. A worn notebook filled with names, contacts from his service days, men who owed him favors, men who knew how to make problems disappear. He closed the safe. The weight of his past settling over him like armor. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The construction site sprawled before Tom like a battlefield cloaked in shadows. The kind of darkness that swallowed secrets whole. When he pulled up, the hulking shape of Max's truck loomed in the gloom, parked deliberately out of reach from the faint glow of the streetlights. Tom stepped out of his vehicle, his boots crunching gravel underfoot, his eyes darting across the perimeter. Old instincts buzzed beneath his skin, decades of civilian life hadn't dulled the soldier's edge he'd carried since youth. He scanned for cameras, for movement. For anything that might betray his presence. Paranoia was a friend he'd never shaken. Max waited by a towering stack of steel beams, a broad silhouette carved against the ink-black sky. 20 years out of uniform, and still he stood like a man expecting an ambush, shoulders squared, weight balanced, eyes sharp. As Tom drew closer, Max's gruff voice cut through the stillness. You look like hell warmed over. The words landed with a rough-edged familiarity, tinged with concern. Tom forced a grim half-smile, his throat tight. You should see the other guy. Max didn't laugh. Instead, he jerked his head toward the truck. Got something you need to see. Come on. Inside the cab, the air smelled of stale coffee and motor oil. Max hauled a battered laptop onto his lap, its screen flickering to life with a dull hum. I've been poking around in Rick's dirty little world, he said. His thick fingers tapping keys with surprising precision. Guy's got his hands dipped in every cesspool you can imagine, real estate scams, protection gigs, money laundering, you name it. But this is the kicker. He swiveled the screen toward Tom, revealing a sprawl of bank statements, property deeds, and shell company records. Tom's chest tightened as his eyes caught the name repeating like a drumbeat, Eleanor. His wife. She's been in on it, Max continued, voice low. Not just warming his bed, she's his right hand. Moving cash, hiding assets. Years, Tom. Years of this. Tom stared at the documents, the cold glow of the screen casting harsh shadows across his face. Betrayal sank into him like a blade. Slow and deliberate, twisting deeper with every line he read. She'd played him, turned their life into a chessboard, and he'd been the pawn. There's more, Max pressed, sensing the storm brewing in his friend's silence. Rick's in deep trouble. Borrowed a fortune from some nasty folks, word on the street is he's scrambling for cash. Desperate. That's why they sped things up with you. More files flashed onto the screen, timelines, divorce papers, asset transfers. They've been at this for months. The plan was to strip you bare, house, savings, everything, then pin his debts on you. Might have even landed you in a cell for their mess. The weight of it crushed Tom's ribs, each breath a labor. This wasn't just infidelity. It was annihilation, methodical and merciless. He'd been blind, trusting, steady Tom, the man who built homes and held his family together. What about Ava? His voice rasped, barely above a whisper. As he forced the question out, Max's jaw tightened. She wasn't supposed to be there today. They screwed up, Rick's goons panicked when she walked in. Got sloppy. Tom's hands curled into fists, knuckles whitening. They hurt my girl, he said, the words trembling with fury. They'll pay. Max leaned forward, his gaze steady. They will. But you've gotta play this smart, Tom. Rick's got friends, cops, maybe worse. You charge in, you're dead or locked up. Tom's eyes glinted, cold and resolute. I'm not killing him. Death's too easy. Too fast. I want them to feel it, lose everything, like they wanted for me. Max studied him, the lines of his weathered face deepening. You've got something cooking in that head of yours. Tom rose, his shadow stretching across the cab. Getting there. Keep digging, bank accounts, deals, anything. I want their skeletons laid bare. Every last one. What about Eleanor? Max asked, voice cautious. Tom's expression turned to stone. She chose her side. She can rot in it. He climbed out of the truck and drove off, the night swallowing him whole. The house greeted him like a stranger when he arrived, hollow, violated, no longer a sanctuary but a crime scene etched with lies. He wandered its rooms, a ghost tracing the edges of a life unraveling. In the kitchen, he spotted the extra phone she'd stashed in her jewelry box, its screen lighting up with messages he didn't bother to read. Behind the filing cabinet, financial papers peeked out, offshore accounts, coded transactions. In Ava's room, he froze. Photos plastered her walls, family trips to the coast, her 10th birthday with cake-smeared cheeks. Graduations where Eleanor beamed, the perfect mother. All a mask. His phone buzzed. A text from Ava, when can you pick me up, he typed back, * tomorrow morning. Rest now. * another message followed, Eleanor, we need to talk, he deleted it without a second thought, the gesture final, a door slamming shut. Sleep eluded him. He sank into his armchair. Cleaning his gun with meticulous care, the metallic clicks a rhythm to his racing thoughts. Lists formed in his mind, names, dates, moves to make. They'd underestimated him. Pegged him as the dependable fool who'd never fight back. They were wrong. As dawn crept over the horizon, he brewed coffee properly this time, the rich aroma grounding him. He'd survived betrayal before, in the chaos of war, but this cut deeper. This was his blood, his home, his child. They'd awakened something primal, and now they'd face the reckoning. The hospital corridors stretched endlessly before Tom, sterile and cold, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. His boots thudded against the linoleum. A steady march that echoed his resolve. The nurse at the station glanced up, offering a tired nod. She'd seen him enough in the last 24 hours to know his face. Through the window of Ava's room, he glimpsed her, small and fragile in the bed, her bruised face angled toward the TV flickering with some mindless show. He pushed the door open gently. "Hey, baby girl," he murmured, his voice softening as her eyes brightened at the sight of him. "Dad," she replied, her tone stronger than yesterday, though pain still threaded through it like a shadow. He eased into the chair beside her, taking her hand in his. The bruises on her cheeks had deepened to a mottled purple, a map of violence he couldn't unsee. His jaw locked. Rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Doctor says I can go home tomorrow," she said, hope flickering in her gaze. "Not home," Tom corrected, his voice firm but tender. "I've set it up for you to stay with Sarah for a bit." Her face fell. "But Dad," "No arguments," he cut in, squeezing her hand. "Home's not safe right now. I've got things to sort out." Her fingers tightened around his, fear creeping into her eyes. "Mom called me." Tom's expression darkened, a storm cloud rolling in. "What did she say?" Ava's voice wavered. "She tried to explain, said it wasn't what I thought." "That Uncle Rick," she faltered, tears welling. "She said I shouldn't have been there, that it's my fault for coming home early." Tom shot to his feet, pacing the small room to cage the fury clawing at him. "None of this is your fault," he said, each word a vow. "Not one damn thing. I should have seen it, should have known something was off." Ava's voice trembled as she pressed on. "They'd whisper when you weren't around. Uncle Rick started showing up more when you were at work. Last week, I saw paperwork in Mom's car, lawyer stuff. I should have told you." Tom returned to her side, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You trusted her. That's not a sin." Her memories spilled out then, Rick's casual visits timed to Tom's absences, Eleanor's late-night meetings, the hushed calls she dismissed as nothing. Tom catalogued every detail, building a mosaic of deceit in his mind. A knock broke the moment. Max stood in the doorway, his hospital admin badge catching the light. "Got a minute?" Tom gave Ava's hand a final squeeze. "Rest up. I'll be back." In the hall, Max pulled him aside, voice low. "Those guys you tangled with? They're not just hired muscle. One's tied to a downtown casino, mob connections. The other's got a rap sheet a mile long, assault, extortion, attempted murder." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Rick's in deeper than I thought." Max glanced around, wary. "There's more. Your brother-in-law's got a guardian angel, someone high up. Cops, judges, somebody's keeping him untouchable. I'm working on names." Tom's phone buzzed, Detective Ramirez wanting a sit-down. "Keep digging," he told Max, "I need it all." Back in Ava's room, she drifted off, the meds pulling her under. A nurse slipped in with fresh bandages. "Mr. Walker. We need to document her injuries again for the report." Tom watched, stone-faced, as they photographed each mark, evidence of his daughter's suffering preserved in cold pixels. "Detective wants to talk to her tomorrow," the nurse added. "No," Tom said, finality in his tone. "She's been through enough. They can deal with me." The nurse hesitated. "Sir. In domestic violence cases, this isn't domestic," he snapped. "It's something else. And I'm handling it." Night draped the hospital in quiet. Tom sat by Ava's bedside, watching her breathe. His phone lighting up with Eleanor's pleas and threats. He deleted each one, his heart a locked vault. The war had begun, and he was ready. Thomas Walker sat alone in the dim light of his living room. The silence pressing against him like a heavy shroud. His fingers, rough from years of hard labor and war, brushed over the worn edges of the military ID he still kept tucked in his wallet. It was a relic of a life he'd tried to leave behind, a life where he'd been a soldier, a man forged in the fires of conflict. Someone who understood that sometimes the only way to answer cruelty was with force. 20 years ago, he'd buried that part of himself deep, trading battlefield dust for the quiet rhythm of a peaceful existence. He'd built a home, a family, a daughter he adored. But now, as he stared at the purpled bruises blooming across her innocent face, that buried soldier clawed its way back to the surface, restless and hungry. The sight of her pain ignited a fury in him. A molten rage that pulsed through his veins, whispering of war. Eleanor, Rick, and their hired muscle had dared to invade his sanctuary, to lay hands on his child, to try to strip him bare. They were about to discover that Thomas Walker hadn't forgotten how to wage a fight, nor the cold precision with which he could dismantle an enemy. The police station hummed with restless energy as Tom pushed through the chaos toward Detective Isabella Izzy Ramirez's cluttered desk. She was a striking figure. Her sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes cutting through the haze of the room like a blade. In her mid-40s, Izzy carried the weight of experience in the lines around her mouth, her gaze unrelenting. Missing nothing. She waved him into a chair with a flick of her wrist, her voice dry as she took in his haggard appearance. "You look like you've been dragged through hell and back, Tom." He sank into the seat, exhaustion tugging at his bones, and muttered, "It's been a rough stretch." Izzy didn't waste time on pleasantries. She yanked a thick folder from a drawer and dropped it between them, her movements brisk. "Got something you need to see. Your wife's been busy, real busy." She fanned out a series of grainy surveillance photos across the desk, each one a dagger to Tom's gut. There was Eleanor, his Eleanor, meeting with slick men in tailored suits. Her expression guarded but purposeful. Izzy tapped a finger on one image, singling out a handsome man in his 30s with a predator's smile. "That's Julian Torres. Con artist extraordinaire. Specializes in real estate scams, offshore accounts, the works. Been on our radar forever, but the bastard's slippery, nothing sticks." Tom's eyes narrowed as he studied the photos, his mind racing. What's Eleanor doing with him? Izzy's lips pressed into a thin line. Torres is the go-to guy for hiding money. Shell companies, untraceable transfers, he's a pro. Your wife's met with him at least 6 times in the last month alone. Tom's chest tightened as Izzy slid more documents his way, her voice dropping lower. 3 weeks back. Eleanor moved most of your joint savings into an account we can't track. The paperwork? Picture perfect. Your signature's all over it. His head snapped up, disbelief warring with anger. I never signed a damn thing. Izzy's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, but her tone stayed firm. No, you didn't. But someone did, someone good enough to fool the bank. She pulled out another stack of papers, spreading them like a map of betrayal. It gets worse. Your brother-in-law, Rick? His businesses are fronts. Money laundering, probably drugs. And those goons who roughed up your daughter? They're muscle for the Castellano family. The name hit Tom like a sledgehammer, reverberating through him. The Castellanos ran the city's underworld with an iron grip, their names synonymous with blood and fear. If Rick was tangled up with them, this wasn't just personal, it was a war against monsters. Izzy leaned in, her voice a urgent whisper. You need to back off, Tom. These people don't mess around. They'll bury you without blinking. His laugh was a jagged, bitter thing. They've already tried to ruin me. They hurt my kid. You think I'm just gonna walk away?" Izzy's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she slid a USB drive across the desk. Her eyes locking with his. "Officially, I can't help you. Unofficially? This has everything we've got: Torres, Rick, their operations. Account numbers, surveillance, the lot. Just, don't get yourself killed." Tom pocketed the drive, his voice steady. "I owe you, Izzy." She grabbed his arm as he stood, her grip firm. "Yeah, you do. And Tom? Whatever you're cooking up. Don't make me cuff you for it." From the station, Tom drove to his bank, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. The manager, a soft-spoken woman with sympathetic eyes, greeted him with a pained smile as she pulled up his accounts. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Walker," she said, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. "The transfers were all above board. Your wife had power of attorney." Tom's voice was a low growl. "Show me every detail, where it went." She complied, and the screen lit up with a trail of devastation. College funds he'd scraped together for his daughter, retirement savings he'd built over decades, all of it siphoned away, vanishing into the ether. Eleanor had been meticulous, ruthless, leaving nothing behind but echoes of their life together. His phone buzzed in his pocket, Max, his old army buddy, texting coordinates for a meetup. Tom found him in the hospital parking garage, a cigarette dangling from Max's lips despite the faded, no smoking, signs. Max was a wiry man, his face etched with years of cynicism, but his eyes still carried the sharp glint of a soldier. "Got those names you asked for," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Judge Michael Preston, he's been greasing the wheels for Rick's cases. Dismisses charges, seals records. The Castellanos own him. Lock and key. As for the bodyguards? Vincent Caruso and Tony Baglia. Career scum. Caruso's still in ICU, you smashed him up good. Baglia walked free this morning." Tom nodded, his mind already turning. "Where's Baglia holed up?" Max's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering. "Why? What are you chasing?" Tom's voice was ice. "Just need a word with him." Max sighed, scribbling an address on a scrap of paper and handing it over. "Your funeral, man." Tom's next stop was home, or what was left of it. Eleanor had stripped the place bare. Her clothes and trinkets gone, leaving an empty shell that mocked him. He didn't care about her things. He headed straight for her office, a room she'd always kept off limits. Her private kingdom of secrets. The filing cabinets stood like sentinels, and when he pried them open, he struck gold. Bank statements, emails, meeting logs, Eleanor had documented her every move. Likely as a shield against her own allies. Now, her paranoia would be her undoing. Tucked in a hidden folder were photos, Eleanor and Rick, tangled in moments too intimate to mistake. Blackmail. Tom realized, his stomach churning. She'd been playing everyone, even the man she'd conspired with. His phone rang, her name flashing on the screen. He nearly ignored it, then thought better of it. Time to flip the board. "Tommy, please," she sobbed when he answered, her voice trembling with desperation. "We need to talk. This isn't what you think." He kept his tone light, almost casual, letting the words drip with venom. "Oh? So you didn't drain our accounts? Didn't stand by while Rick's thugs threw our daughter down the stairs?" Her breath hitched. "I didn't know they'd hurt her." "Rick promised." "Promised what?" he cut in. "That he'd help you bleed me dry and pin his crimes on me?" Silence stretched, thick and guilty, until she whispered, "How did you know about everything?" He said, savoring the weight of it. Julian Torres, the Castellanos, Judge Preston. You should have hidden your tracks better. Her voice cracked with panic. Tom, please, you don't get it. These people, no, he snapped, you don't get it. You brought them into my house, let them touch my kid. Now you get to watch me burn their world to ash. She whimpered, they'll kill you. His laugh was dark. Better men have tried. He hung up, plugged Izzy's USB into his laptop, and dove into the abyss, hours of footage, financial trails, police intel. A separate file on Torres revealed a graveyard of victims, lives he'd shattered. Tom started taking notes. These people wanted blood. He'd show them how to get it. As dusk settled, Tom sat in the quiet, cleaning his old service pistol. The familiar ritual steadied his hands, sharpened his mind. Eleanor and Rick thought they'd cornered a simple man. A construction worker who'd bend under pressure. They'd forgotten, or never known, the soldier he'd been, the things he'd seen and done in the name of duty, the skills etched into his soul. In the shadows, Tom smiled. Time to jog their memory. Later, in a near-deserted bar, Tom met Max again. The man sat hunched in a booth, papers strewn across the table. A whiskey glass sweating in his grip. 2 decades running hospital admin hadn't dulled his edge, his posture still screamed military. Hospital reports, Max said, shoving a file toward Tom. Caruso's got busted ribs, a crushed throat, maybe a limp for life. Baglia's nursing a broken jaw, busted shoulder, and a concussion. They'll pull through. He studied Tom's stony face. You're starting a war, aren't you? Tom's eyes glinted. They fired the first shot. I'm ending it. Max handed over more intel. Torres and Rick have been at it 2 years. Slick setup, prey on desperate folks, peddle fake investments, drain them dry. Eleanor built the framework, handled the paper trail. At least 20 victims, maybe more. Most lost everything. He slid Tom a list of names and addresses. What's your play? Tom tucked it away. Better you don't know. Max smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. These aren't small-timers, Tom. The Castellanos play for keeps. Tom's voice was a blade. So do I. Not anymore. His phone buzzed, Izzy, calling him back. He downed his drink and stood. Max called after him, watch your 6. Tom tossed back, always do. In the police station parking lot, Izzy leaned against her car, the night air cool against her skin. She handed Tom a file, her expression grim. Judge Preston's been cozying up to the Castellanos. Regular deposits, hushed-up cases. You're in deep now. Tom took the file, his resolve hardening. The war had begun, and he'd fight it on his terms. Tom sat hunched over the dining room table in his dimly lit home, the faint hum of the refrigerator buzzing in the background as he sifted through a chaotic spread of bank statements. The numbers glared back at him, deposits to an offshore account, massive sums that dwarfed any reasonable explanation tied to his salary. His fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear but from the slow burn of rage building in his chest. This was it, the paper trail they'd used to reel him in, to sink their hooks into him. He could almost picture their smug faces. Thinking they'd outsmarted him, bought his silence with dirty money. But they'd underestimated him, and that mistake would cost them everything. Izzy burst into the room, her presence electric. Like a storm rolling in. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, slamming a stack of glossy photographs onto the table. The images spilled out, Judge Preston, his polished veneer stripped away. Caught in grainy shots with young prostitutes draped over him, a glass pipe in hand, cocaine dusting the table. Tom's stomach churned, not from shock but from disgust. Preston's got a weakness. Izzy said, her voice sharp and clipped, cutting through the tension. Rick's crew has been feeding it, girls, drugs, the works. They own him, Tom. Completely. Her eyes locked onto his. Fierce and unyielding, as if daring him to flinch. He didn't. Instead, a cold smile tugged at his lips. Useful, he muttered, already calculating the next move. Izzy grabbed his arm, her grip tight. Her nails digging into his skin. Don't do anything stupid, Tom. These people have protection, money, power, connections. His smile didn't waver, though it grew colder, sharper. They've never dealt with someone like me. Back at home, the dining room became his war room. Tom spread the evidence across the table like a general mapping a battlefield, surveillance photos of shadowed meetings in back alleys, financial records with numbers that screamed corruption. Witness statements scrawled in shaky, desperate handwriting. Each piece clicked into place, forming a mosaic of Rick's empire. It was bigger than he'd ever dreamed. A sprawling web that stretched far beyond the real estate fraud he'd first uncovered. Beneath that surface festered layers of filth, money laundering through shell companies. Drug trafficking routes snaking across state lines, prostitution rings shielded by payoffs to crooked cops and politicians. And the mob, the Castellano family, loomed over it all. Their influence a dark shadow pulling strings. Eleanor had known. She had to have known. The realization hit Tom like a punch to the gut, twisting the knife of betrayal deeper. She'd chosen to stand with them, to help them dismantle his life brick by brick. His phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a text from an unknown number, * back off while you can. Last warning. * he stared at it, his pulse steady, then saved the number. They were scared. Good. He grabbed a notepad, his pen scratching furiously as he sketched out the connections, names, dates, weak points. Rick's operation thrived on silence, on keeping victims too broken or terrified to speak, all while hiding behind a polished, legitimate front. But what happened when that mask shattered? Judge Preston was the linchpin, the soft underbelly of their scheme. Take him down, and the whole rotten structure would collapse under its own weight. Tom pulled out a crumpled list Mac had slipped him days ago, Torres's victims, ordinary people chewed up and spit out by the con man's greed. A teacher who'd lost her pension. A single dad whose savings vanished overnight, a small business owner forced to shutter her shop. People with nothing left but anger and despair. Tom's jaw tightened. Time to turn that despair into a weapon. His laptop glowed in the dim light as he typed, fingers flying over the keys. Within an hour, he'd crafted a series of letters, invitations to a private investment recovery meeting, each one laced with anonymous tips about where their money had really gone. Seeds of chaos, planted with care. Next, he dug into the surveillance footage Izzy had slipped him, Preston stumbling out of a brothel, bleary-eyed and disheveled, Preston shaking hands with a known dealer in a deserted parking lot. Preston pocketing thick envelopes from Rick's lackeys. Tom burned 3 copies onto separate drives, one for the media, one for the bar association, one to shove down Preston's throat himself. His phone buzzed again. Ava's name flashed on the screen, and his heart softened. "Dad, when can I come home?" Her voice was small, fragile. "Not yet, baby." "Soon," he said, keeping his tone gentle despite the storm raging inside him. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she replied. "Sarah's parents have been really nice." A pause, then, "Mom keeps calling." "Don't answer," he said quickly. "I wasn't going to," Ava shot back, her voice hardening with a resolve that mirrored his own. "I saw what they did to you, what they tried to take from us. None of that matters." He told her. "You're what matters. Just be careful, okay? I can't lose you too." "You won't," she promised, and he clung to that vow like a lifeline. Get some rest. I love you. After hanging up, Tom sank back into his work, the soldier in him taking over. This wasn't just revenge, it was war. Intelligence gathering, target assessment, precision strikes. His phone lit up again, Eleanor this time. He answered, cutting her off before she could plead. Last chance, he said, voice flat and lethal. Tell me where the money is. I can't, she whimpered, her voice trembling with fear. They'll kill me. Then you better hope they get to you before I do. He ended the call, the line going dead as he turned back to his plans. Rick, Eleanor, Torres. The Castellanos, they'd pushed a trained killer too far, threatened the one thing he'd die for, his family. In the darkness, Tom's smile returned, icy and resolute. The storm was brewing. And he was ready to unleash it. Outside Julian Torres's sleek office building, Tom sat in his truck, binoculars pressed to his eyes. The morning air was crisp, the parking lot quiet, until it wasn't. One by one, they arrived, Torres's victims, 20 souls whose lives he'd torched for profit. A banker clutching a folder, his pension stolen, a widow with trembling hands. Her home ripped away by forged deeds, a contractor whose dreams had crumbled into bankruptcy. They carried manila envelopes stuffed with evidence Tom had painstakingly gathered. Proof of Torres's schemes he'd mailed out in the dead of night. His phone buzzed. Izzy. Judge Preston just signed the warrants, she texted. Move when ready. Tom glanced at his watch. In 30 minutes, Preston would realize his fatal mistake, signing search warrants for properties tied to his Castellano puppet masters. By then, the damage would be done. Inside the building's lobby, the victims gathered, their anger a palpable heat radiating through the glass. Tom watched as a black Mercedes rolled into the lot, Torres, stepping out in a tailored suit. Adjusting his cuffs with the arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable. He didn't see the crowd yet, too busy admiring his reflection in the car window. Tom dialed a number from Mac's list. His voice low and disguised. Mr. Torres, this is David Shunn from the SEC. We've received some concerning reports about your investment practices. I'm in your lobby with some former clients who'd like to discuss the matter. Torres froze mid-step, then turned toward the entrance. Through the binoculars, Tom saw the exact moment recognition hit. The con man's smug mask dissolved into naked terror as he spotted the familiar faces waiting for him. Tom dialed again, this time the local news station. Anonymous tip, he said. Send a crew to 1835 Market Street. Fraud victims are confronting the man who stole their life savings. Within minutes, a news van screeched into the lot. Cameras rolling as the crowd surged forward. Torres tried to retreat, but they were on him, waving documents, shouting accusations, their voices a chorus of righteous fury. Tom's phone buzzed. Rick. He let it go to voicemail, then played the message. You bastard, what did you do? The IRS is here, they're seizing everything. I'll kill you for this. Another call, Eleanor. Her voice breaking with panic. Tom, please, they're saying it was all fraud, that Rick was laundering money. They're freezing my accounts. I need help. He deleted it without a word. His eyes fixed on the chaos unfolding through the binoculars. Torres's suit was rumpled now, torn at the sleeve as he shoved through the crowd, the cameras capturing every second of his downfall. Police cars rolled in, lights flashing. Izzy stepped out of an unmarked sedan, warrant in hand, her timing impeccable. Torres was boxed in, victims on one side, federal agents on the other. His empire crumbling in real time. Tom's burner phone buzzed again, Danny Lee, his inside man. File sent to the SEC, Torres's operation exposed, Rick's connection documented. They'll both go down. Tom started his truck and pulled away, the scene fading in his rearview mirror. One target neutralized, 2 to go. His next stop. A half-finished construction site where he'd arranged to meet Baglia, the hulking bodyguard who'd dared to lay hands on Ava, throwing her down the stairs like she was nothing. Baglia had agreed to talk, thinking Tom wanted peace. He was wrong. Tom parked behind the skeletal building, the air thick with dust and the distant clang of metal. He checked his recording gear. Every word Baglia said would be captured, preserved as ammunition. The bodyguard arrived on time, alone, his bruised face a testament to their last encounter. "Make this quick," Baglia growled, his voice rough with irritation. "I'm not supposed to be here." Tom stepped from the shadows, his presence calm but menacing. "Tell me about Rick's operation. The money laundering, the protection rackets, all of it." Baglia's eyes narrowed, a flicker of fear beneath his bravado. "You're crazy." "I'm not," Tom cut him off, his voice low and steady. "You will." "Because I'm not asking." The air between them crackled with tension, the stakes clear. This was just the beginning. In the dimly lit room, Tom's eyes glinted with a cold determination as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved with purpose, tapping the screen until the soft hum of a recording filled the air. The voice on the audio was unmistakable, his former partner, spilling secrets in a drowsy, unguarded murmur. Names tumbled out like falling dominoes, each one tied to drug shipments, shadowy deals, and the sprawling criminal empire they'd all been tangled in. The bodyguard, a hulking figure with a shaved head and a scar tracing his jawline, froze mid-breath. His ruddy complexion drained to a ghostly white. His thick hands twitching as if they could somehow claw the words back into silence. "How did you?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of dread. Tom's lips curled into a faint, humorless smirk. "Caruso talks in his sleep," he said, his tone casual but edged with steel. "Hospital rooms, turns out, have walls so thin you'd think they were made of paper." The air grew heavy, charged with the bodyguard's rising panic. Tom leaned forward, his posture unyielding, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Start talking, Baglia. Or this recording's on a one-way trip to the feds, and the Cosos." Baglia's broad shoulders slumped as the fight drained out of him. For a full hour, he spilled everything. His gravelly voice weaving a tale of betrayal and greed. He painted a vivid picture of Rick, the slick mastermind whose charm masked a ruthless hunger for power. Rick's ties to organized crime ran deeper than anyone had suspected, a labyrinth of dirty money, secret meetings in smoky backrooms, and a network of corruption so intricate it could choke a city. Tom sat motionless, his phone capturing every damning word, his mind racing with the satisfaction of a predator closing in on its prey. When Baglia finally ran out of steam, his forehead slick with sweat, Tom slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a plane ticket to Miami and a thick wad of cash, enough for a man to vanish and reinvent himself under a new sun. "Disappear," Tom said, his voice flat but laced with an unspoken threat, "or this recording goes live for the world to hear." Baglia's trembling fingers snatched the envelope, his bulky frame lurching toward the door as if the shadows themselves were chasing him. He didn't look back. Tom wasted no time. With a few deft taps, he sent copies of the recording to multiple secure locations, digital insurance policies tucked away in case the Cosos or anyone else decided to come for him. His phone buzzed sharply, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Max, a wiry tech genius with a knack for being 3 steps ahead, texting coordinates and a timestamp. The next phase was in motion. Rick, somewhere out there, would be unraveling now, his empire teetering on the edge of collapse. Eleanor, too, would be scrambling, her stolen fortune siphoned off into accounts so buried even she couldn't find them. Tom pictured them both, Rick pacing in his polished office, sweat beading on his brow, Eleanor clutching her phone in a penthouse suite, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. They were terrified, sloppy, and making mistakes, the perfect prey. Alone in the darkness, Tom's smile widened. The trap had snapped shut, and now the real game began, watching them claw at each other. Desperate to escape the noose he'd tightened around their necks. The warehouse district sprawled before him, a ghost town of crumbling brick and rusted steel. Silent save for the distant clatter of freight trains rumbling through the night. Tom eased his truck behind an abandoned loading dock, the engine's growl fading into the stillness. He ran his hands over his gear with practiced care. The Glock, its metal cool and reassuring, was loaded and pristine. A smaller backup piece hugged his ankle. A quiet promise he hoped he wouldn't need to keep. His phone flared to life with a flurry of texts. Danny, the crew's resident hacker with a mop of unruly curls and a caffeine addiction, reported in. Rick just tried accessing the accounts, they're bone dry. He's losing it. Then Mac, a grizzled ex-cop with a voice like gravel, Castellano enforcers are at Rick's office. They don't look thrilled. Finally, Izzy, the sharp-tongued lawyer who could talk her way out of anything, Preston's cracking, names, dates, the whole damn operation's laid bare. Tom's thumb swiped the messages away, erasing them into the void as he stepped into the crisp night air. Ahead loomed the warehouse, Rick's pride and joy, a fake wholesale electronics front that never shipped a single gadget. Tonight, it would be his undoing. Danny's handiwork had already crippled the security cameras, their red lights dark and lifeless. Tom moved like a phantom through the shadows. His boots silent on the cracked concrete, his heartbeat steady as a metronome. Right on cue, a black SUV roared up to the loading dock, its tires screeching against the pavement. Rick stumbled out, clutching a sleek briefcase to his chest like a lifeline. His tailored suit hung askew, wrinkled and stained with desperation. His once confident face was a mask of pallid terror. 2 Castellano soldiers flanked him, hulking figures in dark coats, their eyes hard and unyielding. "The money's here," Rick croaked, his voice splintering. "All of it." "Just let me explain." The larger soldier, a brute with a shaved head and a neck thick as a tree trunk, yanked the briefcase from Rick's grasp and flipped it open. His scowl deepened. "It's empty." Rick's eyes bulged, wild and frantic. "No, that's impossible." It was there. Someone must have, the second soldier, leaner but no less menacing, cut him off with a growl. "You lost 10 million of the family's money. Mr. Castellano wants answers." Tom chose that moment to emerge from the darkness, savoring the way Rick's gaze snapped to him. Pure horror flooding his features. "Looking for this?" Tom held up a USB drive, its tiny frame glinting under the faint moonlight, bank records, transfer histories. Irrefutable proof of where every cent had vanished. Rick lunged, a guttural snarl ripping from his throat, but the soldiers pinned him back with effortless strength. "You!" Rick spat, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "This is your fault." Tom tilted his head, his tone almost playful. "No, Rick. This is your fault. You got greedy. Sloppy. Did you really think you could siphon cash from the mob and stroll away unscathed?" Rick's protests were frantic, incoherent. "I didn't steal anything. It was business." Tom turned to the soldiers, his voice smooth as silk. "Check his offshore accounts, the ones he thought were hidden. He's been skimming for years, playing both sides." The larger soldier pulled out his phone, his thick fingers clumsy on the screen. A tense minute passed before he nodded to his partner. "Boss says it's true. We found them." Rick's face went ashen, his breath hitching in shallow gasps. "No. Wait, I can explain. The leaner soldier's hand drifted to the holster at his hip, his expression darkening. The boss doesn't want explanations. He wants his money. Rick's bravado crumbled. I'll get it back. I just need time. Tom's smile grew colder, sharper. Time's up, Rick. The feds are closing in. The judge is talking. Your whole operation's a house of cards in a windstorm. The Kosos can't afford to let you breathe. Rick whirled to the soldiers, desperation clawing at his voice. Please, I've got dirt on everyone. Names, dates, recordings. The larger soldier sneered. That's supposed to make us trust you. His gun slid free, suppressor glinting faintly. Tom melted back into the shadows, his work done. 2 muffled shots cracked through the night. Followed by Rick's fading screams, then silence, thick and final. The SUV's engine roared to life and peeled away, leaving the warehouse steeped in stillness. Tom dialed an anonymous tip to the police from a burner phone, his voice clipped and untraceable. They'd find Rick's body, chalk it up to a mob hit, and close the case. Clean. Efficient. His phone buzzed again, Eleanor, her name flashing on the screen like a ghost from a life he'd already shed. This time, he answered. It's over, he said. Cutting off her trembling plea before it could begin. Rick's dead. Torres is in custody. The money's gone. Her voice quivered, thick with tears. Tom, please, I never meant for any of this. Save your lies, he snapped, his tone ice cold. I'm done listening. What am I supposed to do? I have nothing left. You've got exactly what you deserve, he said, each word a dagger. You chose this road. Now walk it alone. He ended the call and drove to the rundown motel where she'd holed up, her once glamorous life reduced to a flickering neon sign and peeling paint. She opened the door at his knock, her designer wardrobe swapped for cheap thrift store rags, her face streaked with mascara and misery. Come to gloat, she hissed, her voice raw. Come to deliver your divorce papers, and this. He handed her an envelope, its contents a ticking bomb, proof of her complicity in Rick's schemes. Try anything, and this goes to the feds. You'll rot right alongside your brother. Her defiance flickered, then died. You can't prove anything. Want to bet? His smile was a predator's grin, all teeth and menace. I've got recordings. Bank records, witnesses, everything. Her shoulders crumpled, and she signed the papers in silence, her sobs echoing as he walked away, leaving her broken amid the ruins of her ambition. Back home. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, warm and golden, as Tom brewed coffee with a steady hand, no burnt grounds this time, just the rich aroma of a new beginning. The morning paper sprawled across the table, its headline screaming, "Major crime ring exposed," and "Prominent businessman found dead in warehouse." His phone buzzed, Mac, checking in. "It's all over the news," Mac said, his voice rough with disbelief. Rick's murder, Torres's arrest, the whole operation blown wide open. You sure about this? It's done, Tom replied. Sipping his coffee, the bitterness a perfect match for his mood. The Kosos think Rick stole their money. The feds think it was a mob hit. Case closed. Eleanor's broke, alone, and running scared. She signed the papers this morning. Mac paused, then, good. Ava okay? Getting there. She's coming home today. After hanging up, Tom skimmed the reports. Danny had wiped their digital tracks clean, Izzy had tied up the legal loose ends, and the Kosos were too busy dodging federal raids to retaliate. The doorbell chimed. And Ava stepped inside, her bruises fading, her smile fragile but real. "Hey, Dad," she said, her eyes searching his face. He pulled her into a gentle hug. Welcome home, baby girl. I saw the news. She murmured. Did you? Better if you don't ask questions you don't want answered. She nodded, understanding flickering in her gaze. Mom called me. Begged me to help her. Said she was sorry. That she had nowhere to go. Her voice hardened. I told her she should have thought of that before betraying us. Pride swelled in Tom's chest, his daughter was forged in the same fire as him. Unyielding and fierce. The phone buzzed again, Detective Ramirez, gruff but satisfied. Just wanted you to know, Torres rolled on everyone. Tom smiled into the sunlight. They'd tried to break him. To take everything he loved. Instead, he'd burned their world to ash, and now, at last, he could breathe. In a world finally free of the shadows that had once loomed so large. The news of Judge Preston's downfall reverberated through Tom Walker's mind like the echo of a long-awaited gunshot. Decades behind bars awaited the corrupt judge, and with him, the entire rotten web of greed and deceit had been dragged into the light. Tom stood in the quiet of his home, phone pressed to his ear, as a familiar voice softened with relief on the other end. I appreciate the update, Tom, she said, her tone carrying the weight of years of shared struggle. Her words softened further, almost a plea. It's over now. Let it go. He murmured a quiet acknowledgement, ending the call with a slow exhale that felt like shedding a heavy coat he'd worn too long. The fight was done. Justice, at least this version of it, had prevailed. He stepped into the kitchen where Ava, his daughter, stood over the stove. The soft hum of a melody floated from her lips. A gentle counterpoint to the sizzling bacon and the rich aroma of brewing coffee that filled the room. Her hands moved with a quiet confidence. Flipping eggs with a practiced ease that spoke of routine, of healing. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes catching his with a question that didn't need much preamble. What now? She asked. Her voice light but laced with curiosity. Tom leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he let the warmth of the moment sink in. Now, he said, his tone steady but carrying a flicker of hope. We rebuild. Together. Ava's smile was small but genuine, a rare crack in the armor she'd built around herself after everything they'd endured. Later that day, alone in the solitude of his study, Tom sat at his desk, the weight of his victory settling over him like a storm finally breaking into calm. Papers and files were spread before him. Each one a piece of the intricate puzzle he'd spent years assembling. Offshore accounts glowed on his laptop screen, millions stolen from Rick, that snake of a man who'd once called himself a friend. Now safely tucked away as a shield against any future threats. Then there were the files on Eleanor, his ex-wife, her crimes meticulously documented in stark black ink. If she ever dared to slink back into their lives, these would be the guillotine to end her for good. His gaze shifted to a photo on the desk, Mac, Danny, Izzy, his allies, his confidants. His brothers and sisters in arms. They weren't just friends, they were a network forged in the crucible of betrayal, tempered by a shared hunger for justice that burned as fiercely as his own. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. An unknown number flashed across the screen, and his hand hesitated over it, instincts honed by years of caution flaring to life. He answered. Voice low and guarded. Mr. Walker, came the reply, smooth and cultured, dripping with an authority that could only belong to someone like Castellano, an old-school figurehead of the underworld. I wanted to personally thank you for exposing Rick's theft. The family appreciates your discretion. Tom's lips twitched into a faint smirk. Just wanted justice, he replied, keeping his tone even. There was a pause, then the voice returned, warmer now. Indeed. Consider yourself under our protection. No one will trouble you or your daughter again. Tom's smirk widened into a genuine smile as he ended the call and deleted the number with a single swipe. Everything had fallen into place, his enemies crushed, his daughter safe. His future a fortress he'd built brick by bloody brick. The soldier in him saluted the completeness of it, a victory as clean as any battlefield triumph. The doorbell chimed through the house, pulling him from his thoughts. He rose, smoothing his shirt as he made his way to the door. Mac, Danny, and Izzy stood there, their faces alight with grins and the easy camaraderie of warriors who'd survived the same war. They carried bottles of wine and a warmth that filled the room as they stepped inside, their voices overlapping with congratulations and laughter. This was his new family, not born of blood, but of loyalty, of shared scars. Tom accepted their praise with a nod, their concern with a quiet gratitude. The naive man he'd once been, the one who trusted too easily, was long gone. What remained was something sharper, colder, a man who'd learned the hard way that danger was a constant companion. But as he watched Ava laugh with their friends, her face glowing with a lightness he hadn't seen in years, he felt the ice in his chest thaw just enough. She was healing, and that made every brutal choice worth it. He'd protected what mattered most, obliterated those who dared to threaten his world. The war was over. He'd won. And heaven help anyone foolish enough to test him again. 5 years later, the city skyline bore the mark of Tom's triumph. Walker and Associates Construction stood tall, its name emblazoned in bold letters across a gleaming glass facade that reflected the bustling streets below. Inside, on the top floor, Thomas Walker sat in his office, a 50-year-old man whose hair now carried more silver than black. His blue eyes, though, still cut like steel, their focus unwavering as he pored over quarterly reports with the same meticulous intensity he'd once applied to military ops. His body, too, remained a coiled spring, decades of discipline and training keeping him combat-ready, a habit he'd never shaken. The intercom crackled to life, his assistant's voice breaking the silence. "Mr. Walker, your daughter's here." He straightened, a flicker of warmth softening his features. "Send her in." Ava strode into the room, 26 now, her presence radiating a quiet, confident grace. Her law degree hung proudly on the wall behind Tom's desk, paid for with Rick's dirty millions, a fact that never failed to bring a sly grin to his face. She'd turned her pain into purpose, specializing in prosecuting financial crimes, wielding their family's past like a blade against men like Julian Torres. "Ready for lunch, Dad?" she asked, dropping her bag onto a chair. Tom closed his laptop with a decisive snap. "Always." He rose, adjusting his jacket. "How's the Martinez case going? Another wannabe Torres?" Ava's smile was sharp, predatory. "Thought he could scam elderly veterans with a real estate con. Bad move. Judge granted all our motions this morning, he's staring down at least 20 years. Tom chuckled. A low rumble of approval as they headed for the elevator. In the parking garage, his new truck waited, still practical, but top of the line now, a subtle nod to the life he'd carved out. Some habits, like his preference for utility, died hard. As they drove, he mentioned casually, "Heard from Mac this morning. Hospital's naming him chief of operations." Ava glanced up from her phone, nodding. "Good. He deserves it." She scrolled for a moment, then added, "Izzy's making deputy chief next month, and Danny's cybersecurity firm just snagged another government contract." Their friends had thrived in the years since Eleanor and Rick's collapse, their loyalty proving a stronger currency than betrayal ever could. The restaurant they pulled up to was upscale yet understated, a favorite haunt. The maitre d' led them to their usual corner table, positioned, as always, with a clear view of every entrance. Another habit Tom couldn't shake, and didn't want to. "Sarah's getting married next month," Ava said as they scanned the menus. "Asked me to be maid of honor." Tom nodded. His mind drifting to Sarah, Ava's rock during the darkest days, a steady presence who'd offered shelter when the world fell apart. Her family had become an extension of his own. Mom tried reaching out again, Ava added quietly, her voice cooling. Tom's hand tightened around his water glass, knuckles whitening. When? Last week, she replied, her tone flat. Email from a new account. Wanted to explain her side now that she's found peace or some nonsense. I blocked her. Tom's nod was curt, approving. Eleanor had made these feeble attempts over the years, each one met with the same icy silence. She'd slunk off to Florida after the divorce, remarried some retiree. Tried to stitch together a new life. Tom kept tabs, not out of nostalgia, but strategy. Know your enemies, even the broken ones. Any word on Rick's old associates? Ava asked, shifting the subject. Their meals arrived, steak for Tom, grilled salmon for her, and he cut into his with deliberate precision. Costas are mostly legit now. Old man died last year, his sons run clean businesses. Julian's still rotting in prison, another decade, at least. He'd maintained a careful truce with the crime family, mutual respect, mutual distance. They ate in companionable silence for a while. The clink of cutlery a quiet rhythm. Company's expanding again, Tom said eventually. Bought that development firm in Phoenix, the one Rick tried to swindle from that widow. Ava's smile was vicious. A mirror of his own. Nice touch. He grinned back. Every move he'd made, every acquisition, had been calculated, either bolstering their empire or settling old scores. Rick's millions had been the spark, now, Walker and Associates was a blaze of legitimate success. Detective Rodriguez called yesterday, Ava said, wiping her mouth with a napkin. Remember that cold case they reopened? Rick's murder? Tom's face stayed a mask, unreadable. Oh. Closed now, she continued, meeting his eyes. Ruled a mob hit. Case inactive. No new leads. They'd never spoken of Tom's hand in Rick's demise, never needed to. Ava understood, some truths didn't need words. She knew her father, knew the lengths he'd go to for family. After lunch. They strolled to a nearby park where Ava had once played as a child. The old swings were gone, replaced by shiny new equipment, funded, quietly, by a donation from Walker and Associates. James proposed. Ava said suddenly, stopping by a bench. Tom turned, studying her. James Chun, a prosecutor she'd met 2 years back, was smart, honest, devoted. Tom had vetted him thoroughly, clean as a whistle. What did you say? Said I need to think, she admitted, sitting down. I trust him, you know. After Mom, it's hard. Tom sat beside her, his voice careful but firm. James isn't Rick or Eleanor. He's proven himself. She glanced at him, searching his face. You approve? I approve of anyone who makes you happy and treats you right, he said, then let his tone harden. And he knows what happens if he doesn't. Ava laughed, a bright sound that cut through the afternoon air. Yeah, he's terrified of you, in a healthy way. They watched the kids play for a while. Parents hovering nearby, living lives untouched by the shadows Tom knew too well. Izzy mentioned they found Eleanor's ex-boyfriend's old storage unit, Ava said. Julian's. Tons of documents, could have caused trouble. Handled, Tom replied smoothly. Danny scrubbed anything sensitive. Far as anyone knows, it was empty. Danny's cybersecurity division had become their shield, information their sword. His phone buzzed, Mac, with the monthly security report. Trust, but verify, another lesson carved into his bones. Sarah wants you to walk her down the aisle, Ava said, standing. Her dad's okay sharing the honor. Tom felt a rare warmth bloom in his chest. Family wasn't just blood. It was the ones who stood by you when the nights were longest. They walked back to the office, passing a construction site for a new women's shelter, a project with Izzy's task force. Another way to tip the scales. Dinner tonight? Ava asked as they reached her car. James wants to talk to you properly. Tom nodded. Tell him to bring that bourbon he's been saving. And remind him I'm an excellent shot. She kissed his cheek, grinning. Love you, Dad. Try not to scare my boyfriend too much. No promises, he called after her. As she drove off, Tom stood there. The city humming around him. 5 years since Eleanor's betrayal, and he'd built more than a business. He'd forged a family stronger than steel, a legacy rooted in loyalty, not lies. The soldier in him saluted the victory, but the father in him knew the real prize, Ava's smile, their friend's trust, a future no one could take away. Tom sat alone in his office. The soft hum of the city filtering through the thick glass windows as he pored over the day's reports. Papers sprawled across his polished oak desk. Detailing construction projects stretching across 3 states, each crane, each slab of concrete, a testament to his unyielding ambition. Investment portfolios. Meticulously managed by associates he'd handpicked for their reliability, glowed with steady profits. Then there were the security briefings. Delivered with military precision by Danny's team, a group of sharp-eyed operatives who ensured every gear in Tom's well-oiled machine turned smoothly. He ran his fingers along the edge of a report. Feeling the weight of control settle into his bones. This wasn't just business, it was mastery, every piece locked into place by his design. His computer chimed softly, pulling him from his thoughts. Max's weekly check-in had arrived, tucked inside an encrypted email that flickered briefly on the screen before settling into stark black text. Eleanor was still in Florida. Her new husband's health crumbling like the last brittle leaves of autumn. Tom's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smirk. She'd fled there years ago, chasing some semblance of peace. But the updates painted a picture of quiet decay. No suspicious activities, the report confirmed, and Tom's chest tightened with a strange mix of satisfaction and disdain. She could rot there. Exiled by her own choices, a ghost haunting her own life. Then there was Julian, parole denied again, locked away with no outside contacts, his world shrinking to the gray walls of a cell. Tom's eyes narrowed as he read the line, a flicker of cold triumph sparking deep within. The man had gambled against him and lost everything. The business dealings under Tayo's were pristine. The territory stable, a calm sea under Tom's steady hand. Judge Preston's death in prison, natural causes, the report claimed, barely stirred him. The old man had been a loose end tied off by time itself. Baglia, meanwhile, remained a shadow in witness protection, his silence as unbroken as the day he'd vanished. Tom leaned back in his leather chair, the creak of it filling the quiet room, and archived the report alongside 5 years of similar updates. The past wasn't dead, it lingered like a stubborn stain, but he'd learned how to manage it, how to box it up and keep it from spilling into the present. It could be controlled, contained. And that was enough. The sharp ring of his phone sliced through the silence, and Tom glanced at the caller ID, James Chun. The young prosecutor's voice crackled through, polite but firm. Requesting a meeting before dinner. Tom could hear the undercurrent of tradition in the request. James wasn't the type to barge in uninvited, he wanted to do this right. To ask permission in that old-fashioned way Tom secretly admired. "Come by the office," Tom said, his tone warm but commanding. "We'll talk." He hung up, already picturing the kid, suit pressed crisp. Shoulders squared, respectful but never cowering. Good signs, all of them. James arrived right on time. Stepping into the office with the quiet confidence of someone who knew his worth but didn't flaunt it. His dark suit hugged his frame just right, not a wrinkle in sight. And his eyes met Tom's without flinching. "Sir," he began, pausing as Tom gestured to the chair across the desk, "I want to discuss Ava." The name hung in the air, soft but heavy. And Tom settled back, folding his hands. "Let's talk about your intentions," he said, his voice low, testing the waters. For 2 hours. They spoke, James laying out his heart with a clarity that surprised even Tom. The young man's emotions spilled out raw and honest, love for Ava, fierce and unshakable. Tempered by a practical mind that had already mapped out their future. He didn't shy away when Tom pressed him, didn't flinch when challenged on the hard questions: money, loyalty. What it meant to join this family. Satisfaction bloomed warm and steady in Tom's chest as James pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, revealing an engagement ring. It wasn't ostentatious. Just a simple band with a single, elegant stone, tasteful, like Ava herself. The prenup he'd drafted was fair, too, no greedy edges or hidden claws. James's background? Spotless. His career as a prosecutor? Rising fast, built on grit and principle. But what struck Tom deepest was the way James spoke of family, how he understood its weight, its demands. The unspoken vows of loyalty it required. "I'll never hurt her," James vowed, his voice steady as steel, his gaze locked on Tom's. "Never betray her trust." Tom tilted his head. A slow smile curling his lips. "No," he agreed, his tone smooth but edged with warning, "you won't. Because you know what happens to people who hurt my family." James didn't blink, didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I know exactly what happens." And he did. Tom could see it in the set of his jaw, the flicker of understanding in his eyes. James had done his homework, pieced together the stories whispered in shadows: Rick's unsolved murder, Ellen's banishment to Florida, Julian's slow unraveling behind bars. He'd weighed the warnings and still chose to step forward. Tom's smile widened. "Welcome to the family, son," he said, clapping James on the shoulder. "Now, about that bourbon." Later that night. Tom stood at his office window, the city sprawling below him like a glittering tapestry. Lights winked in the darkness, each one a piece of the empire he'd carved from the wreckage of betrayal. It had started in fire and blood, Eleanor's treachery, Rick's cowardice, Julian's greed, but it had grown into something greater. A fortress, unyielding and strong, shielding those he cherished. A legacy he'd passed to Ava, forged not just from wealth and power but from the things Eleanor and Rick had never grasped: loyalty, family, honor. Their betrayals had been brutal teachers. Searing lessons into his soul, and he'd built this life on the ashes of their mistakes. Now, he had everything they'd tried to take: respect, control. A daughter who'd never know their weakness, and more. His phone buzzed, a quiet alert from Danny's security team. Routine, nothing pressing. Just the world turning as it always did, threats rising and falling, contained before they could bloom. Tom smiled into the dark, his reflection faint in the glass. He could still hear Eleanor's sobs. See the terror in Rick's eyes, feel Julian's desperate pleas echoing in his memory. They'd thought him soft, predictable, a man they could break. Their mistake had been fatal. And no one would repeat it. His new family, Ava with her quiet strength, James with his steady resolve, Max with his unwavering diligence, Izzy's sharp wit, Danny's fierce protection. Even Sarah's gentle presence, knew what mattered. Loyalty bound them, honor guided them, and Tom stood as their sentinel, a warrior forged in battles they'd never have to fight. The past was settled. Locked away like a beast in a cage. The future stretched out secure, a kingdom he'd won and would never surrender. Thomas Walker remained unchanged in the ways that defined him, a protector who never forgave, a man who never forgot. Let anyone who doubted that ask Eleanor, wasting away in her Florida exile. Let them ask Julian, aging into oblivion behind bars. Let them ask Rick, oh, but they couldn't. Rick's voice was silenced forever, and Tom's smile grew sharp as he turned from the window. It was time to head home, to gather his growing family for dinner. Tomorrow would dawn with new challenges, new chances to prove that loyalty outlasted blood. That his war, long won, had birthed a peace he ruled with the same iron will that had claimed his victory. Some things never changed, and Thomas Walker's devotion to his family, his unrelenting justice for those who crossed it, would stand eternal.